Today we're going to talk about Psalm 22, and I'm kind of curious because this is the psalm that's very familiar to me, but sometimes you kind of get, not everybody is as familiar with the same sorts of things as you are. We all kind of have different things that we're focused on, and a couple of times in the last week, Lou goes, "What are you going to teach about?" I say Psalm 22, and he goes, "Well, which one's that?" I go, "Well, if Lou doesn't know off the top of his head, maybe a lot of people don't." So I'm just curious. I'm not trying to embarrass Lou. Do people know when I just say Psalm 22? Do people know what that is?
I've seen it up there and I read it today.
You read it today?
Yeah. I came in here and read it.
Oh, well, that's cheating. No, that's excellent.
No,
that's
that
good.
was really
That's a really smart thing to do. So you got the background. I'm good. That's fine. It's actually good, so you won't be bored, because if you come in here and everyone's like, "Oh, I know all about that," then what am I here for? So here we go. So this is another lesson that's kind of continuing on this theme about things in the Old Testament that aren't overt prophecies. It's not just saying the Messiah will be killed in this year, and he'll be born at this place and things like that. But this is things that are foreshadowing, that only become clear in hindsight, that they're referring to the Lord, and things about his life and his death and his resurrection and things like that. And I thought it would be kind of, before we get into Psalm 22, last time we looked at a quote from Paul where he was saying that if the enemies knew about what God's plan was for Jesus, they wouldn't have crucified him, right? So indicating that some of this stuff, it's there, but it's not so direct and overt that everyone knows exactly what's going on. It's stuff that becomes clear in hindsight. So in Luke 24, this is after the resurrection, Jesus encounters a couple of people on the road to Emmaus, and they're describing how Jesus is sort of pretending like he doesn't know what's going on, and saying, what's going on? And they're saying, Jesus was this great guy, and he was crucified, and now some people went to his tomb and it's empty, and they're describing all these things, and it's been 3 days since he was crucified. And he tells them that and remember the expectation. Although in the Old Testament there was things about the suffering servant, there's also things about the kingdom, right? And there was a lot more focus among the Jews on the kingdom stuff than on the suffering servant part. And so when they're kind of down about Jesus being killed and all this, he says, "Ought not the Christ to have suffered these things and to enter into his glory?" And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. And so after the resurrection, now he's kind of like revealing these things that were in the Old Testament that were pointing to this, to what happened. And so then a little bit later, he does the same thing with the disciples. He opens their understanding that they might comprehend the scriptures. And you see here a reference to the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. So that's talking about the totality of the scripture at that time, what we call the Old Testament. Those are the three sections, the Psalms being short for the writings. Mm-hmm. So he's teaching people, even after his death and resurrection, he's now teaching all of these things that are in the Old Testament that allude to him and his suffering and his resurrection and all that. So it's pretty neat to see when you read in the New Testament, a lot of this stuff getting pointed out in the Gospels and in the epistles, that a lot of those connections were taught to them by the risen Lord, right? And so among those is Psalm 22. This is a very kind of a mysterious psalm on its face, if you're looking at it from the perspective of this is a Psalm of David written 100 or 1,000 years before Jesus was born or so. a lot of things in here, if you were, say, like a unbelieving Jew or a non-Christian Jew, you would argue that this psalm is strictly about David. But there's a lot of things in here that seem to apply a lot more strongly to Jesus, specifically when he's on the cross, than would apply to David. Things would have to be a lot more figurative to apply to David, and actually seem to be more literal when applied to Jesus. And this describing the crucifixion, this was written at a time when crucifixions weren't taking place yet. The oldest crucifixions that we know of were from about the 6th century BC. This was written about 400 years before that. And so it's describing in great detail not only the circumstances of crucifixion in general, but also some specifics about Christ's crucifixion that wouldn't apply to crucifixions generally. But it actually seems to predate any actual crucifixions from that had taken place, as far as we know. So it begins, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And you'll recall that Jesus called out those words on the cross in Hebrew or Aramaic, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. And then it's translated, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And so when Jesus is on the cross, those words are appropriate, particularly because he became sin, and sin separates us from God. And so in that moment, he did have a sense of being forsaken by the Father. But on the other hand, in those days, the Psalms and the scriptures didn't have chapter numbers, none of the numbering. And so
we actually added that. So
that's right.
The Old Testament and the New Testament were actually combined. There was no separation between them, and there was no
like numbers.
Yeah.
Right. So they didn't call this Psalm 22 back then. How did they identify a psalm? They would recite the first line of it, just like we do with some songs, right? Songs like if we say,
a lot of times people will say, they forget that it's the Lord's Prayer. They'll say, "Did you say the Our Father?" Even
exactly.
They say, 10 Our Fathers and
Hail Marys.
Hail Marys and
Yeah.
Convent.
Yeah, it's just like that. Or sometimes the song America, we call it My Country 'Tis of Thee. In hymnals, in the index, they list songs by their title and also by the first line of the song, because like one will be in italics and one will be in regular type, because you can identify it either way. And
interesting to know.
that's so effectively what Jesus is doing here from the cross is calling out Psalm 22, right?
Yeah.
So people who are familiar with the scriptures are going to hear that and recognize that he's calling attention, is really calling out the title of this psalm, because there's all this stuff going on that parallel in this psalm, and he's calling attention to it. So
I wonder how many people at the foot of the cross, when Jesus was saying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" go.
right, it was surely a mix, because some people mocked him and said, "Why is he calling out to Elijah?" Or they're mocking him, thinking that he's referring to Elijah, and then you'd have the Romans; they'd be completely oblivious, right? And so the Jews would have been sort of a mix, right? You'd have some people that get the reference, and other people that,
and they might not be willing to speak out.
Well, sure, yeah, not in that moment. They're probably like, "Hey, he's talking about that psalm," But they recognized it, and the gospel writers, if they didn't recognize it in that moment, then maybe it was explained to them after the resurrection. But their recording, and Matthew and Mark here both record that he said this from the cross. And let's see. So, let's just read this section here. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me and from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry in the daytime, but you do not hear, and in the night season, and am not silent. But you are holy, enthroned in the praises of Israel. Our fathers trusted in you. They trusted, and you delivered them. They cried to you and were delivered. They trusted in you and were not ashamed. That sounds really repetitive, but the way I have it highlighted here is to point out this is a structure in Hebrew poetry called an introverted parallelism. Sometimes it's a chiasm if there's something in the center, but here it's like a lot of Hebrew poetry will have two ideas that are phrased differently, but the same idea, and we call that a parallelism. It's like in our songs we have rhyming words, rhyming sounds. In Hebrew poetry they have rhyming thoughts or ideas, and it's really neat because then when you translate it into another language, unlike typical songs in other languages that rhyme, the sort of rhyming translates into other languages because you're not focused on the sound but the ideas. You have this repetition of ideas. And so with a introverted parallelism, you have, instead of just like a coupling, you have the first and the last and the second to last. So our fathers trusted in you, in green, is repeated at the end, they trusted in you. And then in between you have, they trusted and you delivered, they cried to you and were delivered. They trusted and you delivered them, they cried to you and were delivered. So those two are like a coupling, and then what's before and after it are a coupling too. So we're going to see a couple of those embedded in this psalm. That's just one example there. Oops, we already went over that. Okay, so reading on we have, but I am a worm and no man. And that worm, we'll come back to that at the end. The Hebrew word is tolah, and there's significance to that. But I only found out about this about a year ago. I always kind of just glossed over that part. In the context of it being a worm, you can see, I'm of no esteem. I'm the lowest of the low. And that certainly applies. But the specific worm that it's referring to, there's meaning in that we'll get to at the end. A reproach of men and despised by the people. All those who see me ridicule me. They shoot out the lip. They shake the head, saying, he trusted in the Lord. Let him rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. So that is recorded in Matthew 27, that the people passing by wagged their heads, and they said, he trusted in God, let him deliver him now if he will have him, for he said, I am the Son of God. So they're mocking him in the same way that this psalm said would happen. And in Luke it says, he saved others, let him save himself if he is the Christ, the chosen one. And this is another one of these introverted parallelisms here. You see, he trusted in the Lord, let him rescue him, let him deliver him, since he delights in him. The two central ideas match, and the two outer ideas match. And then we have another one in the next stanza too.
I have a question.
Yes.
In Psalm 22,
yes.
When it was written, people didn't have copies of Psalm 22. Was it passed down verbally?
It was written.
People? It was written, but what was it written on?
Parchment. Parchment.
So then each copy had to be handwritten?
Right.
Yeah, they were, they'd be at the synagogue.
Scribes.
They'd be at the synagogue.
Yeah.
You didn't take it.
You would have effectively a library.
Okay.
And when copies would get worn out, new ones would be made, and that's what scribes would do. And they had, different ways to make sure that they didn't have errors. They had notes about, what the central word is supposed to be, and how, they had these things. We kind of use something similar in computer language called checksum sometimes. They have these things, when you get done with it, you can count things and make sure that things are in the right place as sort of an assurance that you didn't skip a word or a line or something like that. So starting in verse 9, but you are he who took me out of the womb. You made me trust while on my mother's breast. So that's sort of a traditional parallelism, sort of repeating the same idea there. And then we have another introverted parallelism. I was cast upon you from birth, from my mother's womb. You have been my God. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, for there is none to help. Many bulls have surrounded me. Strong bulls of Bashan have encircled me. They gape at me with their mouths like a raging and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaves to my jaws. You have brought me to the dust of death. So in John 19:34, one of the soldiers pierces Jesus, and blood and water come out. At the time, that probably wasn't understood, the implication of that, but go ahead.
You were about to say it. It's okay.
No, go ahead.
So something around your heart, it's water. So when
Right.
he pierced it, he not only did he pierce the heart, but he pierced that. And so when he pulled it, the spear out, it was water and the blood came out.
Right. So, it's interesting that this says I'm poured out like water, and we actually have this record of John saying that he says that he saw this himself, right? And that would have been confirmation that he was dead. If he wasn't dead already, he would have died very quickly after having it's called the pericardium, that sac around his heart, right? And then other things in there. We have Jesus said that he was thirsty.
I'm confused.
Yes.
So at the beginning, or in verse 12, it says, many bulls have surrounded me. Is that David talking about himself?
Yeah. That part,
So
as far as I can tell, that doesn't have, I don't see a connection to
No.
Jesus in that. But he's talking sort of from David's perspective. He's talking about being surrounded by enemies. That's sort of the overall theme, like being desperate, being having his life threatened, and being surrounded by enemies. So likewise, Jesus, when he's at the cross, is also surrounded by enemies. So, but that specific reference to bulls of Bashan seemed to be talking specifically about David.
So would Psalms 22 be made when David killed the girl's husband when he put him in front of the war, and then because God told him not to, but he still did? Her husband got killed. I can't remember who it was.
Yeah, Uriah the Hittite.
Yeah, would that be like, would this Psalms?
This would have been earlier.
Probably when he was chased by Saul.
Yeah, when he's kind of on the run.
Okay.
Remember when Saul was chasing him?
And
Yeah.
he said God was making David king, and Saul got jealous.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jealousy. Bad.
Yeah. So you have he's poured out like water. His bones are out of joint. So if you're hanging from a cross, you're going to have dislocated joints. And then my heart is melted within me. That typically is thought to be the ultimate cause of death with a crucifixion, like Jesus suffered, would be asphyxiation leading to heart failure. And then the phrase "my tongue clings to my jaws" indicates thirst, that your mouth is dry, and Jesus is even recorded as saying that he was thirsty when he was on the cross. For dogs have surrounded me; the congregation of the wicked has enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet; I can count all my bones.
Mm-hmm.
So. Remember so the dogs surrounding me. Dogs is a pejorative term for Gentiles, or sometimes might be translated heathens, in particular like wicked Gentiles, although from a Jewish perspective that would often be considered redundant. Let's see. So this passage from Matthew 27 is about how Pontius Pilate is ultimately in charge here, and he's representative of Rome. So Jesus is at the mercy of dogs, Gentiles, that have power over him, and the Roman soldiers surrounding him would be the dogs that have surrounded me. And they pierce my hands and my feet, yet I can count all my bones. Because none of Jesus' bones were broken. This is something that was also prefigured by the Passover, where the Jews were told not to break any of the bones. And then when Jesus is crucified, to try to speed things along, the other criminals that were crucified with him, their legs were broken so that they would die faster, but Jesus was already dead. and so none of his bones were broken.
But they pierced him with the spear.
That's right, and they
Why
pierced
would it still come
his
up?
hands and feet. Right.
Do you guys know what Gentile means? Like the definition of Gentile?
In Jewish,
yeah, in Jewish it's goyim. In Greek it's ethnos. That's where we get words like
In English
ethnicity.
it just means not chosen or not Jewish.
Right. Yeah. Anyone who's not
That's the
a
scrub-
Jew is a
That's
Gentile.
the scrubbed version. So
the kind version.
the kind version.
Yeah.
So,
That's why they call them dogs in the,
yes.
Yeah. The let's see. I can count all my bones. They look at me and stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. We'll get to that in a minute here. Another thing we'll talk about a little bit later is this: when they put a scarlet robe on him to mock him. There's a connection with scarlet to that worm we talked about earlier. That'll come up at the end. But the soldiers and the governor took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole garrison around them. So that's the dogs surrounding me. And then they led him away to be crucified. Let's see. Yeah, so we already talked about this. They didn't break Jesus' legs, although they broke the legs of the others. So I can count all my bones. And another reference there in Luke 23:35 that the people stood looking on. That's somewhere in Psalm 22. I don't think I have it. Oh yeah, they look and stare at me, right? So there's not only like it's pretty explicit connections between the Gospels and this psalm. It does seem like probably not a coincidence that some of these details were included, so that not that they weren't true, but that the gospel writers are kind of making sure to include these details so that we can see this connection between the Psalm 22 and the circumstances of Jesus' crucifixion. Then in all four Gospels, we have a record of the soldiers dividing up his garments and casting lots for his clothes. And Matthew 27:35 quotes Psalm 22 directly, making that connection completely explicit. It's also referred to in Mark 15:24. And then in Luke, they divided his garments and cast lots. And in John 19:24, speaking of his tunic, like they didn't want to tear it, so that they didn't have garments to divide evenly. So that's what they cast lots, just like you might flip a coin who gets the good one. Or in this case, we don't know how many there were, but they didn't want to divide up the individual garment, but cast lots to see who would get it.
in 1953, I saw a movie that the nuns told me I was not allowed to see.
Yeah,
Defiant Katie went to the movies
yeah,
and saw The Robe
yeah,
with Victor Mature, and the whole thing was about the crucifixion and about casting lots and he was a Roman soldier,
yeah.
and he in the end he won the robe. He won
The one who
tunic.
won, yeah.
Yeah, and he was looking up at Christ, and tears are coming down his face, and I thought, why don't they teach us that in school?
Why didn't they want you to see it?
I don't know.
Huh.
Because it wasn't Catholic.
Oh, okay.
No, I don't think it was Hollywood, but it wasn't Catholic.
So references in Scripture to the
Just
dog.
one comment, Tom.
What's that?
Go back one.
Yeah.
So this divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. As far as I know, that never happened to David.
Right. That's what I'm.
Right?
Yeah.
And this particular
There's
verse
there's
is
a
like,
lot in here that really doesn't apply to David very well at all in any kind of direct way, right? But yet,
some of the other stuff, it's like, okay,
Yeah.
David was, chased and surrounded and
Right.
stuff like that. That's fine.
Could it
That's
be
a good point.
visionary, you think?
But yeah, this is certainly
That he
prophetic.
prophetic
yes.
or visionary,
it,
like
it is, but we're not told. Like somebody at 1,000 years BC wouldn't have known that this is meant to be a prophecy. It just looks like,
Yeah.
you ever listen to a song and there's things in it that don't make sense, and you don't really know how the songwriter came up with it, and maybe it means something to them, maybe it doesn't. Like,
Yeah.
it's kind of one of the things about art. Like sometimes there's stuff in poetry that's like, I can't really make sense of that, and you think maybe there's some kind of symbol or underlying meaning that you're not privy to,
People
right?
probably thought that for 1,000 years.
Right.
This verse.
Exactly.
I don't know what David was talking about, but all right.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
feel like that stuff is happening today
With
in our world.
what stuff?
We can't really see why things are happening.
Yeah.
But I think they're happening for a reason and the way that they're supposed to be happening. But when I talk to some people about that, they think I'm completely off my.
Yeah.
or-
But I think you're right. Like that's where, in hindsight, when you look at this sounds like it's barely even applicable to David, but overwhelmingly applicable to Jesus, and not with a lot of like heavy symbolism, but like kind of direct, literal language. Yeah. So the scriptural references that we see where dogs are being used as kind of a pejorative term for Gentiles, I didn't list them all on here in full, but Matthew 15, that's the Canaanite woman who comes to Jesus, and at first he kind of ignores her and then says that it's not good to give the food for the children to the dogs, right? Because because Jesus, during his earthly ministry, was focused on Israel. He said, I did not come except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And so when a Canaanite woman came, he wasn't inclined to help her right away because he was focused on Israel. And then he said that, and she said, but even the dog gets to eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. And then he admired her faith and healed her, but at first he wasn't. And so that term dog was used referring to her. And in Revelation 21:12, that's where we're talking about the New Jerusalem and the walls. And then in the next chapter, there's a reference to outside. You have sorcerers or dogs, idolaters, sexually immoral, and murderers. And so those are the non-Jews and the heathens and the evildoers outside, and dogs is listed among them. And then in 1 Samuel 17:43, that's Goliath mocking David, saying, what am I, a dog that you come at me with sticks? So he's, even as a Gentile, he's sort of referring to himself as a dog, or at least it gets recorded. And then in 2 Kings, someone's told to do something pretty horrific, and he says, what am I, a dog? The idea was that heathens, people who didn't know God, were inclined to do tremendously wicked things, and the term dog was used especially in connection with their wickedness. So there's a connotation. It's not just that they're Gentiles, but that they're wicked.
What happened to Jezebel's body?
Torn apart by dogs, actual dogs.
Yeah. Dogs.
And then this last one, Psalm 59, we'll actually take a look at that one in a minute here. So in John 19:10, Pilate says to Jesus, Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have the power to crucify you and the power to release you? And then Pilate was ultimately the one that sentenced Jesus to be crucified at the request of the Jews. And so in verse 20 there, deliver me from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dog. Now here you could say sword. He wasn't literally at the threat of sword, but sword in the sense of governmental authority, like in Romans 13, that the governing authorities don't bear the sword in vain. So the sword is a symbol of their authority and power. And you have a little bit of a parallelism there too. Deliver me from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dog. So sword there is a representation of the power and authority. that the dog has. So this Psalm 59, it's long, but we just have some excerpts here, beginning in verse 5. Now therefore, O Lord God of hosts and the God of Israel, awake to punish all the nations. Now the nations there is the Hebrew word goyim, which also is their word for Gentiles. Do not be merciful to any wicked transgressors. At evening they return, they growl like a dog and go all around the city. And then that's repeated down in verses 8 and 14. You have all the nations in derision, they growl like a dog. So that's stated twice, referring to Gentiles. So where it says the nations in our English Bibles, in this case the New King James, that's the Hebrew word goyim. There's a footnote that's, if you click the footnote next to nations, it'll say Gentiles. Those words are interchangeable. So sometimes Gentiles is referred to as the nations. It's really anyone but the Jews. So even in the New Testament, you see this sometimes. The nations is used, and it'll be the word ethnos. That's the Greek equivalent of goyim. And that's where we get words like ethnic, ethnicity. So then now this is the turning point in Psalm. Now you have answered me. So he's crying out to God to deliver him for help. And now this is the answer. I will declare your name to my brethren. In the midst of the assembly, I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All the descendants of Jacob, glorify him and fear him. All you offspring of Israel. For he has not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, nor has he hidden his face from him. But when he cried to him, he heard. So that's another section, Leah, that seems to apply a lot more to Jesus than to David. This whole second portion of the psalm seems much more applicable to Jesus than David, where God is answering. In Matthew 28, this is at the end of the gospel after the resurrection. He says, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brethren, referring to the disciples, to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. This is the only place where he refers to the disciples as my brethren. It seems to maybe be another callback to this psalm. I will declare your name to my brethren. That's the only place in the Gospels where the word brethren is used rather than disciples, referring to the 12 or the 11 at this time. In Hebrews 2, this is quoted directly, referring to Jesus. This quote, I will declare your name to my brethren, pointing out that this is about Jesus. So let's see, did we read this already? Okay, this is the next section. My praise shall be of you in the great assembly. I will pay my vows before those who fear him. The poor shall eat and be satisfied. Those who seek him will praise the Lord. Let your heart live forever. At the ends of the world all the ends of the world shall remember and turn to the Lord. All the families of the nations, that's that word goyim, Gentiles again, shall worship before him. For the kingdom is the Lord's, and he rules over the nations. So that never happened to David, right? David became king, but he became king of Israel, not of all the nations. And certainly the nations, if you say shall worship before you, it sounds like he's the subject of the worship, right? You could look at it that they came to, they became proselytes, that they came to Jerusalem or Israel to worship the Lord, but you could also interpret it to mean they're literally worshiping the one who was suffering at the beginning of the psalm. And then, the kingdom is the Lord's, and he rules over the nations. again, David never ruled over the other nations, but Christ will one day, right? He's the King of Kings. So in Matthew 28, the Great Commission, Jesus says to make disciples of all the nations. And that word, again, that's the Greek word ethnos, which is the equivalent of goyim in Greek. All the Gentile nations, not just Israel. Now, when you read the Great Commission in the different Gospels, you see that they were going to get there eventually. They were told to start in Jerusalem, and that they would branch out to Samaria and then the ends of the earth. And that never really happened for the 12 because of Israel's unbelief, the leadership, that God ended up turning to the Gentiles through Paul. But the plan initially here was for the 12 to go to all nations. That's where we have this commission, that was the long-term intent for the 12. And God ended up going to the nations through Paul instead. And when that happened, that was a big shakeup because the Jews had been thinking of the Gentiles as dogs and living separate from them at God's direction for many centuries or over 1,000 years. So it was a big paradigm shift when Paul came on the scene, and now the Gentiles were receiving salvation without having to become Jewish first. Are we out of time? Okay.
Almost.
Okay. We'll finish the psalm, and then next week we'll get into the side things, because we're almost done with the psalm. All the prosperous of the earth shall eat and worship. All those who go down to the dust shall bow before him, even he who cannot keep himself alive. A posterity shall serve him. It will be recounted of the Lord to the next generation. They will come and declare his righteousness to a people who will be born, that he has done this. So in Philippians 2, we read that at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow, every tongue confess, that all those in heaven, all those on earth, and of those under the earth. So people who are living, people who are dead, people who died trusting in God, who are in heaven, people who died in rebellion to God, who are not with God under the earth.
That means
everyone, right? And so in Psalm 22, you have all those who go down to the dust shall bow before him, right? Those who are already dead, those who die. And so that's reiterated in the New Testament concerning the Lord. And then in Isaiah 5, both Philippians 2 is also calling back to Isaiah 5. Every knee shall bow, every tongue shall take an oath. But it also has that tie into Psalm 22, referring to every includes those who are dead, not just the living. And so we're almost out of time. We'll talk about a couple of the finer details next week because there's not enough time to get through that this week.
Good
so
job.
we can wrap it up there.